All right, another episode of the podcast. I'm back in Windsor after having the pleasure of traveling around the United States. One place I got to go was Missouri. And while I was there, one person I got to meet briefly, but I got to see her presentation, was Mary Dennehy. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm very welcome to be here. Thank you.
So tell us a bit, first of all, before we talk about the Masonic side of it, about your job and the presentation, which I got to see, the presentation you made at Missouri's most recent annual communication.
hmm I was up until about a week and a half ago the projects coordinator for the Missouri Bicentennial. 2021 is the 200th anniversary of the statehood of Missouri. And August 10th, 1821, they finally let us become a state. Most people think it's 1820 because our state seal actually says 1820. Because in 1820, when we submitted our Constitution and everything for admission to the Union, we were rejected because Missouri wanted to be a slave state because it's Missouri. But so instead they said, well, if you want to be a state, we have to admit a free state first. So Maine was admitted in 1820 as our sister state, and we had to wait a year to become part of the Union in 1821.
And so with that position, just tell us what brought you to the Missouri's Grand Lodge annual communication. What is it about that position that got you not only an invitation but a presentation to the Grand Lodge?
That is the weirdest story. So I'm part of a Masonic family. On both sides of my family, my mother's side can trace our Masonic roots back to, well, before Missouri was a state. My dad didn't have any Masonic roots in his family until he married my stepmother, and her Masonic roots go back pretty far. Not quite as far as my mom's, but pretty far. And so when I got the opportunity to work on the Missouri Bicentennial, and I saw that the Grand Lodge of Missouri was having their bicentennial at the same time, I thought, man, we need to work together because this is the perfect opportunity for Missouri Masons to really get out state forward, because we're sharing this birthday essentially. And so I sent many messages to Grand Lodge to say, hey, I'm doing this. We're doing a time capsule. We're doing all of these different things. And I'd love to get the Grand Lodge involved so that we can make this relationship happen. Nothing happened. We're talking a year. And then crunch time comes and the deadline's coming for the time capsule, and August 10th is rolling around. And then I get a call from the new, at the time, the Deputy Grand Master, Ty Troutlar, saying, hey, we got this, I have this email and it has your name on it. And tell me more about this. What's going on? And so I told him about the things that are happening, and he's like, man, I wish we could have kind of gotten together before this. And then I told him about my Masonic background. And he said, wow, can you come talk to us at our annual communication? And I was like, I mean, I can, but the bicentennial is really kind of over by that point. So all the big stuff is done, but we still have some little things I can talk about. He goes, yes, come talk about your family and how your Masonic roots and how Missouri Masons tie into the bicentennial of the state. And I'm like, sure, okay, I can do that. I can do that. So before I knew it, I'm speaking at annual communication. And as a former Joby, man, let me tell you, that was a thrill and a half.
Sure, before any further, the term former Joby, not a lot of people, even Masons, I'm guessing, especially newer Masons in Canada, would know about that term and what a Job's daughter is. So what is a former Joby?
So Jobies are the nickname for Job's daughters. The International Order of Job's Daughters, and my former Bethel mates are going to kick me because I don't remember as much of the history as I should, but was formed to give the daughters, granddaughters, nieces, stepdaughters, young female relatives of adult male Masons an into the Masonic family and Eastern Star. And so it's based around the book of Job in the Bible. The three main officers are the three eldest daughters of Job. So it's a really great thing. You start when you're 11 and you can go all the way up until you were 21, I think. And yeah, so I started when I was 13 and went all the way through until college. And then my sister did the same thing. And my mom's a former Job's daughter. My stepmom's a former Job's daughter. So yeah, it's a family tradition. If you are a member of this family, you go into some sort of Masonic something, whether it's Eastern Star, Rainbow Girls, Job's Daughters, D. Malay in the case of my nephew.
So when Grand Lodge, approached you and you agreed to attend the communication and make the presentation, just what were your thoughts about making the presentation, and how did you plan out what you're going to talk about? What were your thoughts in terms of creating the presentation?
Well, I wanted to make it as interesting. It was a room of historians, and I have a degree in British literature, so there was a lot of research involved. I knew a lot about the Bicentennial and about what was happening, and my own Masonic history. So my first phone call was to my mother, who is the family historian, genealogy person. And I said, okay, I know our roots go back really far. I'm doing this thing. And of course, she got really excited and freaked out. I need to know names, dates, places, and pictures because I want to put together a slideshow. And they've asked me to throw in my own Missouri Masonic history. So my mom went digging through everything and sent me this long email full of pictures that had no names on them. So I didn't know who was who. So that was a fun, interesting puzzle. But in order to tie what was going on with the Missouri Bicentennial into the Masonic Grand Lodge Bicentennial for Missouri, I wanted to find instances going back from the beginning of statehood as far as I could of Missouri Masons who've made an impact on Missouri and American history. So I went back through and found some prominent Missouri Masons, or at least Masons who eventually lived in Missouri, and started the presentation kind of with that to lead people into why the history of both things are so important.
And did you, I guess before we talk about some of those Masons, I know you stuck around after you made your presentation. I spoke with you for a few minutes. What was the feedback like after you made your presentation from the Masons in the room and attending the communication?
It was overwhelming. I said in my presentation, when I'm finished, I'll be out in the atrium. I have some Bicentennial swag I'm happy to give out, and I can answer some questions about Bicentennial programs. And I never made it out the door. There was a line of people just waiting to talk to me, and I haven't been around that many people because of COVID in so long. It was very overwhelming, but it was humbling too. It was just everybody wanted to talk to me. Everybody had questions to ask, and they all said what a great opportunity this is. And a lot of people wanted me to come and talk to their lodges about Missouri history and Masons, and of course do this podcast. And I was like, man, I'm not qualified for that. I just threw together a 15-minute presentation because they asked me to. But it was very, very positive. Everyone was really impressed with the kinds of things that were going on for the bicentennial and the little bits and pieces of information I was able to gather. So,
Well, you mentioned brethren asking you about joining, asking you about attending one of their meetings to do the presentation. Um, and even, this podcast and talking about, you saying you're not qualified. But I got to say, first, I thought the presentation was terrific, but also, one thing I've been encouraging Masons to do through this podcast, or encouraging lodges to do, is, bringing in, I guess in your case, you're not really outside speaker because you have so much Masonic history, but bringing in
close enough.
speakers they wouldn't normally have to talk about subjects that are interesting and unique. And even, outside of Missouri, I'm a big believer that, Freemasonry somewhere should be of interest to Freemasons everywhere. So, any state or province or anywhere that wants to learn more about Freemasonry in Missouri, get in touch with yourself, because I just think it'd be a great presentation and something of real interest for Masons anywhere.
Thank you.
So with that in mind, if somebody is watching this and does want to talk to you about presenting at their lodge or the history of Freemasonry in Missouri, is there an email address they get in touch with you at, or?
Absolutely. You can get in touch with me using my personal email address. It's rowaneelder@gmail.com. And I'm happy to talk to people with what I do know. And like I said, the Missouri Bicentennial is 2021, as is the Missouri Grand Lodge Bicentennial. So it's definitely an interesting year for people that live in Missouri.
So let's talk about some famous people who lived in Missouri, particularly famous Freemasons. Probably the top of everybody's list would be Brother Samuel Clemens.
Absolutely.
Mark Twain. So what can you tell us a little bit about this distinguished brother?
Well, obviously, Samuel Clemens, his middle name is actually Langhorne. He's known as Mark Twain, major American writer. His stories and novels are famous for their humor, their vivid details, memorable characters for sure. My husband's from Hannibal, so he grew up inundated with Mark Twain and Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn and all of those wonderful tales from Mark Twain. And I've been able to go and visit his boyhood home, the cave that was the inspiration for the cave where Becky and Tom got lost in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. And just such iconic American stories stemmed from that. And don't know what else to say about that. He was a very powerful, creative man. So,
to your knowledge, because I have to admit, I have not read much of any of Mark Twain, though I really should. Not for another reason, he's a fellow Mason. To your knowledge, did he ever, either in like a published work or in correspondence, did he ever write about his Masonic journey and experiences?
not as far as I'm aware. I mean, he came from a time when those kinds of they were very secretive about. I mean, more so than now, about their Masonic roots and ties in those days. It's hard to find Masonic roles from those periods to find out who was a Mason and who wasn't. If you don't know from family legend, then it's hard to find. And it's one of the reasons that my Masonic history is so incredible, is that we have all of those documentations and all of those things and those family histories to know for sure how far back my family was part of the Masonic order. So no, I don't think that he did. He did write about a lot of the what's the word I'm trying to think of? Ideals that are very true to the Masons. Brotherhood and, trying to treat your fellow man better. So those things, I think his Masonic journey definitely had an impact on his writing, but I don't know that he ever actually wrote about being a Mason.
And what are some other, that you mentioned in your presentation, some of the other kind of famous or influential Missouri citizens who are also Freemasons?
Well, starting back from the very, very beginning of the Louisiana Purchase, you've got Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. So Lewis and Clark, the explorers who went through the Louisiana Purchase and basically, mapped all of that out and Missouri out for the United States. They were the explorers in 1804 that came through, and it was a 2-year expedition from the Missouri to the Pacific Ocean. So that's from the very beginnings of Missouri and its surrounding areas. And then you have Senator Thomas Hart Benton. He was a prominent lawyer and political leader during the first half of the 1800s. He fought against extending slavery further into the territories. He wanted to keep things more free than most political figures of the time. Of course, Mark Twain, General John Pershing in the 1840s. He was one of America's most accomplished generals, most famous serving for commander of the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I. And I'm trying to remember, I know I said this in my presentation and I don't have those notes in front of me, but during the annual communication where Harry Truman retired as Grand Master, he presented General Pershing with an honorary status as a member of the Grand Lodge at that particular annual communication. So that was pretty cool. It was a little tidbit of information that I found in some books buried way deep. J.C. Penney, he is a businessman who started, J.C. Penney Corporation, so a department store chain. And of course, President Harry Truman.
I mean, I've heard, I don't know if you can speak to this, but I've heard that, of all the Masonic presidents, which there have been several, that Harry S. Truman was perhaps the most active or the most forward about his Masonic involvement.
Yes, I think that's very true. I think by the 40s, there are pictures, there are portraits of him, in his Masonic regalia, just like almost as many as George Washington, honestly. I think he was probably the most active that publicly active, other than the founding fathers, really. And the Masonic ties in the presidency are myriad. There have been so many presidents that have been members of the Masons. And then that pretty much stopped in the more modern era. And I think, if I remember correctly, we haven't really had a Masonic family member in the White House until Bill Clinton, and he was a de Molay. He never actually became a Mason. I remember my mom telling me this, and I think I'm right, but I wouldn't quote me on that. So anybody watching, if you Google and I'm wrong, I'm sorry.
Well, then leave a comment down below. Leave a comment.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Well, I've heard the same, that the last Masonic connection was Bill Clinton, and that was as a de Molay. And then before that, the last one was President Truman.
Mm-hmm.
There was none between Truman and Clinton.
I don't think so, because I know Kennedy wasn't. I know Nixon wasn't. So yeah, I think Truman was the last one, and then up until Bill Clinton, and I don't Trump, I highly doubt it. Yeah, I don't think Bush had any Masonic ties. But again, you could Google it and tell me I'm wrong. There were no public ones at any rate that I know of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of the public side of it, or the openness that President Truman had about his Masonic history, especially comparing it to, I guess his president, FDR, who I understand was much more reserved about his Masonic history. Although, interestingly enough, we have one of my favorite letters at the Masonic Temple here in Windsor, Ontario, is a letter from our Grand Lodge upon the passing of Brother Franklin Roosevelt, just instructing all lodges to pay a period of mourning on his passing. But having said that, I understand he was much more reserved, and previous Masonic presidents had been more reserved about it. Do you have any thoughts as to what it was about either the fraternity or about Brother Truman that encouraged him to be more open about it? Was it his being from Missouri? You're all very friendly down there, or was there something about? I guess what do you think it is? What do you attribute his openness to?
I will say Missourians definitely have a hey, this is me, and if you don't like it, lump it kind of mentality as a general whole. So there's definitely that. But there's at least in the United States, I don't know what it's like abroad, but there's a stigma, or at least there used to be, of a negative stigma, a mystery about Masons and the Shriners and other secret societies. People in the States tend to kind of look at those things and be afraid of them. I remember when I was in middle school and I joined Job's Daughters. Some friends of mine heard that I had joined Job's Daughters, and all of a sudden they're like, "Oh my goodness, you're part of a cult," and they wouldn't talk to me for like 3 months because they were terrified that I was doing something sinister because I was part of this secret organization and all this other stuff. So I think that has a lot to do with at least past reserve when it comes to being a public figure and being a part of the Masons. Again, I can't quote me on that because I don't know for sure what people's thoughts are. But from my own experience, I know people tend to freak out about what they don't understand. And I don't know what it was about President Truman, because I'm not a Truman historian, but he just let it out there. I mean, he let people knew he was a Mason, and he made sure that he followed his path no matter what. But I think that was true in all of his life, not just his Masonic leanings, but also his political leanings, his personal leanings. I think that was just who he was. Once he set himself on a path, I think he just followed it. So yeah.
Looking back at the Masonic, well, not just Masonic per se, but like the history of Missouri and the important role that Freemasons and Freemasonry has played in the state over the last 200 years. What were your thoughts being at the annual communication in terms of the current presence of Freemasonry and Freemasonry going forward, or even more generally, fraternities, civic organizations, all of these type of things that used to take up such a large role in society. Just as somebody who, I know you said your major was in British literature, but as somebody who's invested in the history of Missouri and the state, with your projects and your work, I guess, how do you see the role of these type of organizations and groups, both in the history of Missouri and moving forward?
Well, I know there's ebbs and flows. I know for a very long time, the Masonic orders, not just in Missouri, but all over, at least in the States, we're having a hard time recruiting people, which I don't understand, because the ideals of the Masonic order are phenomenal. But I guess, like any organization, you have these times where it's feast or famine. You have everybody in the world that wants to be part of it, or no one at all. I was very pleased to see more people my age and younger at annual communication than I thought I would see. So that made me very happy. That tells me that we're getting closer to a flow instead of an ebb. So the gentleman I sat next to at the table, with all the other grand people, was either my age or just a little bit younger. So, and I'm totally not going to tell anybody how old I am, because that's just asking for trouble. But so in that younger generation, and that's a good thing. He's in a position of authority in his own lodge, and also in Grand Lodge. So that tells me that more people are becoming interested. Younger people are becoming interested. My own Eastern Star chapter was definitely needing more members, and we're getting more people in as the time goes. There are Job's Daughters chapters and D. Malay chapters that were so close to failing just a few years ago, who are now getting an influx of younger people. Like my nephew is now a D. Malay. So that's a good thing. And that tells me that the tradition will continue, that it's not something we have to worry about going away. And that's a very good thing.
Now, I do want to go back, talk more about some of these important and, these important Masons in Missouri history. Lewis and Clark, that's something I know very little about them. The only thing I know is there's a movie there's a comedy movie with the guy from Friends. I can't think of it. And Chris Farley was on it too. I forget what it's called, but anyways, that's all I know about Lewis and Clark. So my history is not the best on it, but you mentioned Lewis and Clark. You mentioned the Louisiana Purchase.
Yes.
First, what was the Louisiana Purchase, and also how were Lewis and Clark involved in it, and what? All I know is they started off. You mentioned that they went exploring on behalf of the president, the administration, but like, what exactly was a purchase, and their role, and what did they contribute?
So in 1804, the 1800s, Napoleon sold this enormous tract of land in the middle of basically the entire Midwest of the United States to the Union, to Thomas Jefferson, which is funny because it really wasn't his, but he sold the whole tract of land to Thomas Jefferson. And in 1804, Jefferson sent his, Mason buddies, Lewis and Clark, to go check it out, to map it, to find out what was there. So the two of them went, and like I said, they went from, oh goodness, my brain just stopped working there. From Missouri, so the Mississippi River, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, to chart out the entire western area, but mostly that Midwestern part that we had just purchased. So the actual purchase of the Louisiana Territory was for $15 million, and that was in 1803. It basically doubled the size of the United States. So from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains was what the Louisiana Purchase was. So Meriwether Lewis was in charge of the expedition, and Lewis Clark was his Clark was his partner. And they wanted to they were hoping that there would be a waterway that would link the Mississippi to the Pacific Ocean. so that they were hoping there'd be an easy route to just take the river across and get all the way to the other side of the United States. And of course, there was no easy way to get from point A to point B. So, yeah, that was basically the Louisiana Purchase and that particular expedition. In 1904, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of that expedition, the 1904 World's Fair was held in St. Louis. I'm sure everybody has heard of, or maybe has heard of the musical Meet Me in St. Louis. That was Judy Garland. It was a musical based on that particular point in time. So there's a huge fair in Forest Park, and some of the buildings are still there. The St. Louis Art Museum is part of that. The the Muni. Lots of the buildings in Forest Park are still there, so you can visit these places. But the ice cream cone was introduced at the 1904 World's Fair, which is why the ice cream cone is the official dessert of the state of Missouri. So just another little piece of information. But yeah, so there were things going all over the place in the summer of 1904 to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Louisiana Purchase.
You mentioned, and it's a good point to bring up, President Jefferson was also a Freemason. To your knowledge, did Lewis and Clark and the president, did they run into each other in any Masonic settings? Did they ever attend lodge together or visit, or even in correspondence between them? I don't know how much of a public record. Was it ever mentioned?
That I'm not entirely sure of. I mean, in those days, in politics and public life, you couldn't throw a stone and not hit a Mason, because that was just the basis of politics and the infrastructure of how America worked, because most of the people, if not all of the people who were involved in the Revolutionary War and starting the new government, most of the founding fathers were Masons. So that was just kind of how it was. So whether they all attended lodge together, I don't know.
It'd be tough. I'm just thinking of the travel aspect of it, because I'm not sure where Thomas Jefferson is from versus Missouri.
Well, but see, Lewis and Clark weren't from Missouri. They were from, I want to say, God, hold on, let me look this up. Virginia. Within writing distance. Lewis was born within writing distance of Thomas Jefferson's house, Monticello. So yes, they probably knew each other.
That would connect to why they were chosen for the expedition?
More than likely.
And something else I wanted to discuss, though I'm not sure if you have any records of this, Freemasonry, or just in general, the Civil War, because if I'm not mistaken, I'm Canadian, so if I am, Missouri, Missouri shares a border with several of the Union states.
It was a split.
Okay.
Missouri was very split. As a matter of fact, there's a family story with my maiden name of Truesdale that the old Scottish spelling of my name was Trou. And there's a story that during the Civil War, half of the family sided with the North and half of the family sided with the South. And the half of the family that sided with the North changed the way that their name was spelled from Trou to True, because they felt that they were the true patriots and the true Americans. So they changed their name. So that's a family legend coming from my father's side of the family. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, but it makes for a good story. So there's a split. I don't think any place, I'm sure it was all over the place, but Missouri exemplified that old brother versus brother adage that you hear so much about the Civil War, because it really was a split in the state.
And so in terms then of, I don't know if you have any knowledge or any thoughts on the kind of Masonic aspect of it. I think to my area, Windsor, Ontario, our oldest lodge in this district, um, and I might actually be wrong on the date, but if I recall correctly, it's 1804, and it's Thistle Lodge in Amherstburg, which is right on the Detroit River.
Mhm.
And there is, I believe this is the case, I've heard the story that, the day before the War of 1812 was officially was made official, the commander for the British forces in Canada and the commander for the American forces were both Freemasons, and they both met together in lodge, the day before. And then there was the fight, and then they met again afterwards.
Right.
And you hear about stories of Masons in the War of 1812. Masons finding each other on the battlefield and showing mercy to each other. And then obviously in the States, you have a lot of similar stories with the Civil War, the friend to friend exhibit at Gettysburg, probably the most well known example of that. But just from your, um, did you ever come across any stories about, either within the state itself or even between Masons visiting other states, um, any effects that the Civil War had on the craft during that time? And was there examples of, opposite sides coming together for lodge and then splitting off again to fight each other?
No, but that's a really interesting idea. And that I don't know. That would have to be something that would definitely be a question for the research lodge, because I'll bet someone's got documentation somewhere. It wouldn't surprise me, simply from the way that the state itself was split, and because, like my family story, a lot of families were split. So it would make sense that things like that happened. I just don't know any of the documentation.
Could you and forgive me because, like I said, I know very little about the Civil War. I'm from Canada. That's my excuse. Could like during the Civil War, could somebody from say Illinois travel into Missouri and vice versa, or was like all travel between the states kind of cut off?
And that's a question I don't really know. I mean, you read literature of the time period, and you read about um, Northerners and Southerners meeting all the time. But whether it's true or whether it's works of fiction, I honestly have no idea. I can't imagine be them being able to restrict that kind of thing, simply because they didn't have the kind of well, travel infrastructure that we have now. So I would think someone just happened to ride a horse across the border, unless they ran into a battle. I don't see how that could be stopped. I'm sure it was discouraged, but I don't know if there was a ban per se on how that worked. But again,
Well,
I'm not a historian, so I'm not 100% sure.
if anybody does have any information about this, throw a comment in there about visitation between lodges during the time, because that is a very that's subject I'm quite interested in. So I always want to learn more about it. Um, but for yourself, the one thing I did want to talk to you about, and I think this is a good place to end it, is you know with all your work on the Missouri Bicentennial, and then you connecting that to Freemasonry, but even in general, just all your work on that, and I mean some of the projects that you talked about, the quilt is just really really cool project that was you guys were working on.
Mhm.
Why do you think it's important for well for Missouri in particular to celebrate 200 years, but also just for any city, state, whatever the entity is, to celebrate and try to preserve these milestones and have time capsules and take a moment to think about how best to preserve and tell stories from the past.
Well, I mean, just some of the questions that you've asked me over the last hour or so. Um, that's why documenting these kinds of things is important. Did people go back and forth between the lodges? I don't know, but there could be somewhere a letter somewhere talking about, how someone from Illinois went to a lodge in Georgia. But if we don't keep these things, how are we going to know? It's important. Missouri in general, and I guess just the United States or the world, I guess, we've been through a lot as a people, whether you're from Canada or the United States or any of the other countries across the globe. Everyone's always evolving and everyone's always changing. But if you don't know where you came from, it's hard to know where you're going. It's hard to see where you're going. I really believe that that old adage or quote, those who don't learn from their history are doomed to repeat it. So knowing things like important Missouri Masons, or about the Louisiana Purchase, or the fact that Missouri wanted to be in the Union and couldn't because it was a slave state and they needed a free state. These things teach us lessons. And we need to know those lessons so that we don't do more stupid things, or that we continue to do the good things that we're doing. In 100 years, who knows? The dynamics of the world or the state or your country or your city could be completely different. And all of those organizations that people belong to right now and all of their good works, the monuments and the parks, they could all be gone. And if we don't document them for the future, then how do people know who we were and how we lived? And while the Bicentennial has been a challenge because of COVID, we still found ways to celebrate as a people independently, yet still together, because we were all celebrating this at the same time. So there was a unifying force, which is always nice. So things like time capsules to document little things across the state, things like the quilt, where you get to see how people all across the state view their counties, because that was the point of the quilt. We wanted people to depict their individual counties in some sort of work of art. So the quilt has a ton of different mediums, a ton of different skill levels, but everybody saw their individual counties in a different way, but it comes together in one beautiful tapestry. So it's a great representation of what the state of Missouri really is.
Sorry,
And
what is that? Where can people find that quilt? Is it displayed in like the state capitol, or?
it is right now until October 21st. It is at the Platte County Museum in Platte City, Missouri. After that, it'll be at the Joplin City Hall from the 27th to the 29th of October. The entire month of November, it will be at the Andrew County Museum in Savannah, Missouri. And then it will be on display briefly in December in Benton County. I'm not entirely sure where, but they haven't set that yet. But you can see pictures of it on the Bicentennial website, which is Missouri2021.org. And it's the word Missouri spelled out and then 2021.org. And you can find a link to the quilt, and you can see all of the quilt itself. And then you can also go in and look at the individual quilt blocks that actually made the quilts, and then the ones that were submitted that weren't chosen for the quilt, because we got more than we needed.
It's interesting. I'll leave a link to that website in the description. Everybody click on it because it's very cool. I was after I finished at Missouri, I ended up in Paducah, Kentucky, where they have the National Quilt Museum. Any thought about taking the quilt out of state to do a quilting tour?
Honestly, that's a really good thought. I don't know. As far as I know, it's going to be archived at the State Museum, or at the State Historical Society in Columbia, Missouri. But beyond that, I don't know of their plans to display it. I think that's still up in the air and up to the Bicentennial Commission.
I know I said last question a second ago, but something that we've been working on, that I've been working on, is trying to get funding to digitize our archives here at the Windsor
Mhm.
Masonic Temple, because we're dealing with, so Freemasonry just in the city of Windsor dates to 1854. And so in our building, we have documents dated to 1854 and even earlier if you count some of the county stuff. As you were working on the Bicentennial project for Missouri, I mean, did you come across, or I guess, has Missouri worked on, I'm guessing you had some very old records, some old notes, some old correspondence, the
Yes.
process of trying to digitize some of these or preserve them electronically in case something happens to the physical copies?
Yes. So the State Historical Society of Missouri has an entire section devoted to a group of archivists that are devoted to doing just that, taking old things, articles and pictures, and making sure that they're preserved online in an archive. And if you're interested in that kind of thing, honestly, any state historical society, not necessarily a county or a city, but any state historical society across the country, I'm not quite sure how it works in Canada, any of those places should be able to help someone with those kinds of projects. So I'm sure there's a Canadian equivalent of a historical society. I don't know how to find them. That being said, the State Historical Society of Missouri, shsmo.org, is a good place to start because you can always contact them and they would have the resources to be able to tell you where your avenue would be to head toward that direction outside the country. I'm sure they've got the resources for that.
And just as someone who, professional life was consumed with this bicentennial and finding these records, how did you find were you able to look up a lot of digital records and use those, or did you find, and working with the paper records, did you have a lot of old documents you're looking at? I guess, what was the digital versus analog approach to this?
I didn't have a lot of analog, honestly. The biggest analog part I had, frankly, was we did a poster contest for children all across the state of Missouri from third grade through high school to draw their version of a bicentennial poster and send it in. So my most analog part was collecting those and then scanning them onto the website. So I didn't do a lot of physical research, but my first task when I started was we have a photograph collection called My Missouri 2021, which you can also see online on the website. And people all across the state, some other states as well, sent in photographs of things all across Missouri, different things that they thought were picture worthy. I've seen more cows than you can possibly imagine. But they didn't give a lot of information on some of those things. So they would send me pictures of old buildings that they thought were very cool, or flowers or cows, rivers. So I had to do a lot of digging to try and find, okay, what is this building? What cow am I looking at? So there was a lot of Googling and deep diving into different historical society websites all across the state, trying to figure out what I was looking at and what its significance was beyond just being a pretty picture, because I had to write captions for all of these things. And there were 996 photographs that we received, all of which are on the website if you're interested. So that was my biggest research project, I guess. Excuse me.
You can't just caption cow beneath the picture. You actually have to.
No, because in 200 years, who knows if the cow mutations, I don't know. But I know now a Guernsey, Jersey cow, or I did. I think I've blocked it all out of my brain. But for the first 3 months of my job, which was fine because I was working from home because of COVID, that was what I did, was looking up captions of photos, because with COVID going on, I was a Bicentennial projects coordinator with not a whole lot of projects to coordinate because nobody was leaving their house. So yeah, that was fun.
I mean, that's just a good example of, this is something I talk about with Freemasonry, but I suppose it could apply to anything, right? It really is the little things and the details that make something special, whether it's a picture or a quilt or whatever it is, taking the time to find the details and being able to communicate those
Mm-hmm.
uh, is one of the things that makes an anniversary, well, it makes anything, but makes an anniversary that much more special.
Yeah. So I'm hoping, maybe next 100 years, which I'm sure I won't be around for, but the next the tricentennial, hopefully people will go through and be able to look at the quilt or pictures of the quilt and the things that are in the time capsule, because we also asked people to write little notes to the future at the different events that we had. We had these index cards where people could write something and put their own little contribution into the time capsule for posterity. So that was fun. So I can't wait to see or hear when these things are re-examined, people's reaction to some of them.
That's an interesting point. The last day of the Missouri annual communication, the Grand Master, made his address, and he held up a 100-year service pin, and he said, theoretically, it's possible that somebody joining Masonry today could, in 100 years, receive this service award, which, people are living past 100. I think the oldest is like 110, I heard. So it's not inconceivable you might have a 118-year-old in 100 years if, life expectancy keeps going the way it's going. So it's interesting to think, who might be around 100 years from now and who might be seeing those things.
Yeah, like I said, my nephew joining the DMLA, who knows what, by the time I'm gone, I hope he has, grandchildren who are Job's Daughters or DMLA or Rainbow Girls or just now joining Masons. And that would be amazing to keep, the family line going, pre-statehood all the way through the tricentennial. That would be amazing.
That brings up something I started in Windsor, and I talked about this at Grand Lodge. I encouraged other Masons to consider it, and it relates to your work. When we have a new Mason be initiated into Lodge, after his initiation is finished, when I was Master, I encouraged them to write a letter to themselves that was then put in a sealed envelope with their name and the date of their 25th anniversary into the craft. And then, so this started in 2015. So our first letter isn't scheduled to be opened until 2040. But then we have a whole bunch of letters which will be presented back to the member with their 25-year pin when they hit that anniversary. So just a side note for any Masons looking at doing stuff like that or looking at new projects they want to do. The letters seem to be popular. We have a whole stack of them waiting to be reopened again. If you join Masonry when you're 20, 21 in Ontario, then, imagine when you're 46 getting a letter that you wrote when you were 21 years old.
Right.
To look at.
My grandmother, my stepmother's mother passed away in 2019, beginning of 2019. And my stepmother presented me with her Eastern Star Bible. And I opened it, and on the inside, she had a very old piece of paper that when I pulled it out, it was a typed note from the worthy matron at the time of Grandma Ann's initiation. And it said, I am so-and-so. This is your initiation for such and such on this date. During this time, this person is the worthy grand matron, and so on and so forth. So I have this piece of history inside this Bible from her initiation, the day she went in like 1940 something. I don't remember. I don't have it handy. I don't have it in front of me. And it's just this wonderful little gem of history that is very, very, very dear to me. So I just, things like that make me giggle and just smile, because, you know, in another 100 years, if I hand this Bible to my niece or my daughter or my granddaughter or whatever, you know, how much more excited are they going to be if I have mine in there with it? So yeah.
You know, I started a like a project called Square and Compass Tasks, and the first task was I was asking people to share their most prized Masonic possession with the hashtag Square and Compass Tasks. Everybody should do that, but I'm guessing would that be yours, the Bible, your most prized Masonic possession?
That, and I also have my other grandmother's gavel. The day I was installed as worthy matron of my Eastern Star chapter, my mom presented me with my grandmother's gavel. And so I used that throughout my term as worthy matron. And I think those two things are probably my two prized Masonic possessions, and they're from my grandparents on either side. So
That is very cool. Thank you for sharing that with us, and I'll put that up there too. And like I said, everybody, every Mason or Eastern Star or Demole or whatever it is, if you have a prized Masonic possession, Job's daughters, that's all part of the Masonic family. So throw up something on the socials, let us know. And thank you so much for joining us all the way from Missouri, not only for being here today, but also for, you know, the work you did on the Bicentennial and attending the Grand Lodge. I love the presentation, and I'm hoping when we have our Grand Lodge next year, hopefully it's in person, and hopefully maybe there's somebody who can talk about Ontario history and the Masonic connections therein would be wonderful, because there's a lot there as well. But thank
you'd
you so
have to
much.
let me know if that happens, because I'm very interested. I think that would be a fun thing to see.
I will for sure, absolutely. And thank you so much. And just one more time, if you want to throw out the website where people can take a look at the posters, the pictures of cows, the quilt, all that good stuff.
Absolutely. So it's Missouri2021.org, and that's Missouri spelled out, and then 2021.org.